And I'd like to introduce Ellen Siegel, who will introduce our program for today. Thank you.
Okay, it's great to be back. Great to see you all. Folks on Zoom, good to see you too. I would like, before I introduce Shane Williams, our speaker today, I want to talk about a concept to hold in mind while we listen to Shane. And I'd like to read something called Holding Creative Tension to you, just a paragraph. I want you to picture a rubber band. If I had a rubber band and it was hanging off my hand, there are a couple of ways to deal with the whole climate crisis mentally. One way is depression. And so the rubber band is down here and there's a loop and nothing's happening. The other way to deal with the climate crisis is pie in the sky. I have the rubber band up here. Everything will work out okay. The scientists will figure it out. It's not so bad anyway, and we still have the rubber band hanging loose here. The concept is put your hand inside the rubber band and stretch it, and there's a creative tension between the despair and the pie in the sky won't do anything. So hold that image. I'm going to read from something from Peter Senge. People often have great difficulty talking about their visions, even when the visions are clear. Why? Because we're acutely aware of the gap between our vision and reality, and the gaps can make a vision seem unrealistic or fanciful. That gap can discourage us or make us feel hopeless, but it's also a source of energy. If there were no gap, there would be no need for any action to move towards that vision. Indeed, the gap is the source of creative energy. This is creative tension. And so our speaker today is Shane Williams. He's with the Department of Environmental Protection for Alachua County, and he is an expert on the tension between reality and vision. Brief background on his profession. He's a stormwater and water resource engineer for Alachua County's Environmental Protection Department, and he's been with Alachua County since 2018. Before that, he worked for Marion County for 14 years. He's an expert in stormwater and stormwater treatment standards. He's also a PhD from University of Florida and graduated from Villanova University, Philadelphia, my hometown. I teased him at lunch because he's got a lot of personality for an engineer. And then he let us know that he's current president of the Florida Stormwater Association. He's also an active dad because his wife has a very demanding job that's not really 9 to 5, and he's a marathon runner. So with that, I'd like to welcome Shane Williams. Thank you for sharing what you know about Alachua County with us.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to everybody online. So when you're ready, you can just cue up the presentation. So when I came to Alachua County from Marion County, I thought my job was mostly going to be water quality projects and administering our stormwater treatment code, which we were in the process of adopting at that time. Little did I know that on top of all of that, I was also going to become, for at least a period of time, the climate change guy. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is it's a big project that we have, and we're in the final stages of it, is our climate vulnerability analysis. And this is a comprehensive look at the risks that the county, its infrastructure, and its citizens are going to face moving forward into the future. And as an added bonus, I'm going to give some late-breaking results that I literally got emailed to me on the way over. So you're going to hear about these first before anybody else. So maybe I'm too excited about it. I don't know. All right. So a little bit of background with climate change in Alachua County. In 2020, the county commission really began to get interested in the effects of climate change on the county, and so they directed staff to come up with a climate action plan. Now, once we received that direction, one of the things we realized is that to actually really form an effective action plan, you really need to know what your vulnerabilities are. So you need to know how things are going to impact you. Because if you don't have that, then you can't really plan effectively and take action. And so we knew that a lot of coastal counties, the larger coastal counties, Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, particularly in Southeast Florida, Tampa, Pinellas County, a lot of the coastal counties had done vulnerability analysis, and their focus mainly was on sea level rise. We don't really have to worry about sea level rise. We do, and I'll get to that, but we don't have to worry about it in the same way a coastal county does. So we realized our big issue is going to be inland flooding from the tropical storm Elsa, Hurricane Irma, both county-wide flooding events. And there were some other things that we also wanted to look at too. Ironically, at the same time we were developing the scope for this project, the state was also taking an interest in this. And the state in particular, they were realizing that inland counties were not really paying as much attention to the impacts of climate change as they thought they should. So while we were developing a scope, the state was developing a grant program. So perfect timing, parts of the work that I'm gonna show you the results of today are being paid for by the state through a Resilient Florida grant. This I highlight at the bottom, but it's just part of a large set of climate actions that the county has taken. A couple of them I want to point out here. A Citizens Climate Advisory Board. How many of you know that the county has quite a few advisory boards? There's an environmental advisory board, so I saw a few hands go up. I'll make a plug for that, is that if we do have vacancies when people rotate off the board and don't want to serve another term, so if it's something that might interest you, look at our advisory boards and see if maybe you want to participate on one of those. We have for many years had what used to be called the Joint Water Policy Committee. That's a joint committee of 3 county commissioners, 3 City of Gainesville commissioners, and a commissioner from one of the smaller municipalities. We expanded that to also include climate. So the Joint Water and Climate Policy Committee, you can think of them as a steering committee. We periodically, that's about every 6 months, go back before that committee, explain where things are with this project. They provide us feedback and guidance, and they're basically sort of our steering committee. Internally with staff, we have a climate planning group. I just mentioned we've been awarded a Resilient Florida grant, and my counterparts in public works actually have been awarded some too for actual capital projects. We completed a greenhouse gas inventory report, which is basically, this is the carbon footprint of the county as an entity, as a governmental entity. City of Gainesville also too, and I'll talk about how that figures into our climate planning efforts. And then a whole host of other activities, and then where we are now is finishing up the climate vulnerability analysis, which is going to allow us to finish our climate action plan. So taking that list and showing it really the workflow, how this works together, our climate action plan, we really are looking at 2 tracks, a mitigation side and an adaptation side. The something like a greenhouse gas inventory, which is, like I said, this is our carbon footprint. This is how many greenhouse gases we emit as a county entity. And then what can we do to reduce that carbon footprint? I work on the adaptation side. So I look at, these are the things that the impacts that we think are going to happen, are projected to happen, and then what can we do to prevent the worst of those effects from happening? What changes do we make? What projects do we do to take critical infrastructure that's at risk of flooding, make it not at risk? What do we need to do to make sure that our water bodies remain healthy into the future? The big thing with vulnerability, of course, in an inland county is flooding from extreme events, tropical storms, hurricanes. In a span of 4 years, we had 2 major countywide flooding events, and that doesn't even tell the whole story because there have been localized flooding events at other times too. And so this is typically the type of thing that we see. So I think that's 39th Avenue at Meadowbrook, often floods, and part of a larger area of flooding. But it also, it's not just the infrastructure, it also affects individual citizens. So this is a subdivision in the same area. Yes, the entrance road is flooded, which is an inconvenience to everybody in the subdivision. but there are 3 houses also in here that are also flooded and have sustained repeated damage in that 4-year period. So it has a direct impact on a lot of our citizens. But there are other things too that impact us. I don't know if you've heard the term climate migration. Anybody heard that term before? Yep, so climate migration is the movement of people from an area being affected by climate change into another area. And in Florida, one of the things that we expect to see moving into the future is people leaving the coastal areas. So people who have no ability to adapt to rising sea levels, they're going to move inland. And so we included that too, because that has an effect on us. More development means more potential for more pollutants to enter our water bodies. It means more services that we have to provide, whether it's traffic capacity in roads or even schools. So climate migration was something we also wanted to take a look at. And then there are other things too that affect population, but also have some other impacts too that I'll talk about. So we also included in this looking at the impact of high temperatures. What is the impact on workers and citizens in the county of high temperatures in the future? Groundwater and water supply. With climate change, we're going to see changing patterns in rainfall and drought patterns. So that has a potential impact on the availability of our drinking water, which is also used for irrigation in agriculture. Surface water impacts. I'm going to show you some things that are projected to happen to our lakes that probably aren't going to be very good for the lakes. I mentioned agricultural production, and then of course wildfire. We are in an area that has a high wildland urban interface, so wildfires are a risk for us too. So a lot of things that we looked at, when we can't look at everything, and we can't go into a great detail on every topic, but what we wanted to do is we wanted to look for things that impact citizens either health-wise or financially, but also then have an impact on our natural and water resources too. And some of these impacts can be a little bit surprising. I think everybody intuitively understands that if agriculture farmers are losing crop yields because of climate change, that they're going to irrigate more, potentially fertilize more, and that means increased nutrient pollution in our groundwater and our waterways. Lower lake levels. Lower lake levels, we know that when the level in a lake, when a lake starts to dry up, the water quality gets worse. So we invested a lot of money in improving water quality in a lake, and climate change may start to work against us at some point. I mentioned climate migration, but wildfires. Wildfires actually have an impact on our water bodies, and it happens 2 ways. We're a land manager. We have a lot of conservation land in the county that we manage for fire. That's going to change in the future, probably going to change how we manage our lands. But when you look at where our conservation lands are, they're meant to protect water resources. So when a fire burns land, it changes the hydrology and releases a pulse of nutrients that eventually will end up in that water body. Lake Santa Fe is a great example of that. I think there have been several fires in Santa Fe Swamp, but I'm trying to remember when the big one was. It was 2011, I think. There was a significant fire in Santa Fe Swamp that basically burned the entire summer. And after that fire, there was a noticeable decrease in water quality in that lake that persisted for years. So this slide, it's got a little animation on it. And I created this in either a moment of madness or a moment of inspiration. I'll let you decide which one it was. But it's the web of how climate impacts so many different things. Everything starts with atmospheric temperature. Atmospheric temperature drives everything with climate change. And so from that, you have a first tier of events. A warm atmosphere holds more water, which means when the big storm comes, more rain falls. Of course, high day and night temperatures, that's a lot in the news right now, right? Changing precipitation patterns and drought. As the storms get bigger, what we're seeing is that the dry periods in between them are also getting drier. So we're flooding, but we're drying out at the same time. And then sea level rise. But this first tier of impacts then starts to have other impacts down below. So sea level rise leads to climate migration, but climate migration leads to more developed land. It means more wildland urban interface, which means a greater wildfire risk. Health impacts, the day and night temperatures have health impacts, but they also have impacts on agricultural production. And the precipitation, changing precipitation and drought patterns, well, there's a whole host of impacts there. And then surface water and groundwater interact with each other. So an impact on one of those impacts the other and vice versa. So if that's not fun enough, you have that second tier of impacts. Well, then you got a third tier. And a lot of these on the third tier, they're pointing right at water quality. That's sort of the forgotten thing about climate change impacts. We know temperatures, we know flooding, but water quality impacts are also a big deal too, at least from what we found. So I don't know, was it madness or inspiration? Which one? Both, okay. All right, so what does the future look like? Well, how this project does is we use the climate projections from global climate models, but they're downscaled, which is a big fancy term for taking global results and finding the impact locally. We approach this with the assumption that there's going to be very little mitigation. So in other words, there's going to be very little effort globally to reduce carbon emissions. So that's maybe not quite the worst case scenario, but it's definitely not as optimistic as some people would look at it. And we had a good technical reason for doing that. By making that assumption, we see trends clearer. So if we make an assumption that there's going to be a lot of reduction in carbon emissions into the atmosphere, then we don't really see climate trends very well. And so it kind of makes it hard to decide see what the actual impacts could be. So to do something like this, you almost want to assume a case that's maybe a little bit worse than what you hope is actually going to happen. And then specifically on rainfall, and I'll talk about it a little bit when we get to that section, we use some work that Florida International University did for the state to take current rainfall data and project it out into the future all the way to the end of the century on what they think the storms are going to look like in the future. Did I put that up here? And the data we use, by and large, is the latest to run. So it's the latest set of climate predictions from the UN, from the International Climate, the IPCC. I forget what the acronym stands for. So it is the latest set of data. All right. So since temperature drives everything, I'll start there. And it's in the news. So what are we saying? Well, temperatures are going to increase. But there's a bit of good news in this. The biggest increase in that, at least for Florida, for Alachua County, is going to come after 2040. So believe it or not, there is good news in climate change. So despite what you hear in the news, and you have to remember, every place in the country, the impacts come at different times and in different ways. So while the Southwest may be very hot and has heat indexes that are getting up there really high to dangerous levels, for us, yes, temperature's going to increase, but the worst effects of it are going to come at the end of the century. So we have time to plan and adapt for that. And it's going to come, and these are average temperatures, so they don't look all that dramatic. But the other takeaway in this is that it's not just the daytime temperatures are rising, it's the nighttime temperatures will rise too. And that's significant because we need the temperature to cool down at night so that our bodies can recover and we stay healthy and able to work again the next day. The average number of days with high heat index is also going to increase, but there's something interesting in this graph here. When you look at the hot and very hot, so the two bar charts in the middle, and you look at it through time, well, they're going down, right? So that seems a little odd. if the atmosphere is getting hotter, why are those going down? And the reason is because the hot and very hot days are now going to become extremely hot days. So while you see that decrease, you see the big increase on the last one. So that's the significance. And this is an example of something that we've seen throughout this process, is that climate change, the extremes become more extreme. So that's what we're seeing here. It's a great example of this happening. So, you know, presently, anytime the heat index goes above 105, there's a heat advisory put out, but we don't see too many heat indexes above 130, but as time goes on, we're going to see a lot more of that. So that's going to have some pretty profound effects for how people live and work. So we can take that and look at exposure, and that's a lot of that's defined by, if you're in an area that has a lot of development, you've heard of the urban heat island effect. So that's a measure of, when you have a lot of development, that's a good measure of urban heat island effect. Then also how much tree cover you have too. And then adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity really is someone's ability to adapt to the situation. So does that person or that family have the financial capability to buy new air conditioning, or to move to a home that has better better thermal properties? And then you can assess that in that little grid of risk. And so we've done that for the county by census block. And so here's what we found. And the other thing too is we can overlay the areas of high exposure, of high risk, with certain groups that we think are at risk. So if you're over 65, we know that you're at higher risk for heat-related impacts if you're outdoors. So we can overlay that by the census blocks in the county where we have a high percentage of citizens over 65, and match that up with the darker red, the higher vulnerability areas. Another group, this one I didn't know until we did this, people who live in mobile homes. Well, it turns out that mobile homes don't have as good thermal properties as a site-built home. They're harder to cool down, basically, is what it comes down to. So people who live in mobile homes are at a higher risk of rising temperatures. And so we can do the same thing, the same overlay. So you can see the western part of the county has a large proportion of mobile homes, and so, an area of higher risk. Daycares, schools. You hear that from time to time about an athlete, either a college athlete or a high school athlete, who has a heat-related illness during a game or during practice. So we can also look at the same thing there too, and overlay that with where the schools and daycares are located. And again, also the very young infants and young children, they also are much more susceptible to heat illness than adults are. And then finally, there is one other group, unfortunately, because it's a group of people that moves around, you can't really do the same overlay, and that's people who work outdoors. So some of my coworkers, maybe the men and women who work in our conservation lands, they primarily work outdoors. The men and women in public works who are working out, repairing roads, they work predominantly outdoors. So everybody who works outdoors, agricultural workers, another example, but workers who work outdoors are also much more vulnerable. All right, so speaking of agriculture, what's going to happen to our farmers and our local food production? So we want to take a look at this for two reasons. First of all, not the impact to the farmers themselves, because it's a potential financial impact, but also agriculture is also, it's a potential source of our biggest water quality problem, especially in groundwater areas in the aquifer, is nutrient pollution. And nutrients come from fertilizers. So what we're seeing is that the frequency and severity of drought is going to increase, particularly at the beginning of the rainy season. So the rainy season, which for us, we typically starts into May, into June, maybe the middle of June every year, what we're going to see in the future is that drought at that time of year is going to be more frequent, more severe, and that's going to continue on into July. So really, you're seeing, I'll call it an expansion of the dry season and maybe a little bit less of a rainy season in the future. So what does it mean? Well, the way we look at what it means for crops is we look at crop modeling. And we can't go too in-depth into this. We would need to do a whole separate agricultural vulnerability analysis to really go take a deep dive into agriculture. And I think we're going to do that at some point. But for this, what we did is we looked at certain what we called index crops. So it's typically, an index crop is the crop that is most frequently grown in the county. So believe it or not, we grow a lot of corn. So as a field crop, corn was used. As a vegetable crop, it's actually watermelons. Watermelons are the biggest vegetable crop grown in the county, fruit and vegetable crop grown in the county, but there's not a good crop model for watermelons. So the next best thing that we could look at was snap beans or snap peas. And then a forage crop, Bahia grass. Bahia grass is grown in cow pastures. We do have a lot of cattle ranching in the county and in this part of Florida in general. So those are the three crops that we looked at. The end result, the end result on that is that for all of these crops, yields are going to decrease. Corn, it's going to be pretty rapid. Based on the crop modeling, probably by in a relatively short period of time, 10, 20 years, corn's probably not going to be a good crop that you can grow anymore. Snap peas, they will last a little longer, but then once you get to the second half of the century, the heat stress and the water deficiency stress just gets too high and those yields start to drop too. Bahia grass is going to do pretty good. Grasses in general do good under warmer temperatures. So everybody's going to become a cattle rancher, right? Not necessarily. Because guess what? Animals are affected by heat just the same as we are, and that heat stress is going to increase over time. And we deliberately put cows here. We did dairy cows, but we deliberately put cows up here because it's the cows who forage on the Bahia grass. So over time, the heat stresses on livestock is going to increase, which means that there's going to be efforts taken to cool livestock, and that's going to lead to more water use, actually, because that's how they do it. They'll spray water. But it also means that we're probably going to see, possibly going to see a change in the breeds of cattle that are ranched in Florida. So there are species that are more, breeds that are more heat tolerant. So we're probably going to see more of those breeds in the state than what we have now. And I talked about that just a second ago, that for livestock, I think you'll see different breeds that are more heat tolerant. With crops, well, what's going to happen there? And that we don't know, but there are a couple of things that could happen. You could have whole new varieties of agriculture in the county, or you could see new cultivars that are more heat resistant, more drought resistant, require, basically utilize nitrogen more efficiently. So there are things that we can do moving forward, and we have the University of Florida here, so they'll be at the center of a lot of that work about what agriculture is going to look like in the future. All right, climate migration. This turned out to be one of the more interesting and fun parts of this project because it turns out no one's ever tried to do what we did before. So we broke new ground. And we did this in coordination with the Bureau of Economic and Business Research at the University of Florida, so BEBR. So they make the official population projections for the state. So they were subcontracted to do this work. All right, so the blue is the official state projection. So that doesn't take into account climate migration, but that's the projected population growth for Alachua County. Red is the population projection with climate migration added in. A lot of big numbers on there, but what does it mean in practical terms? Well, what it means is by 2040, that's 2,000 additional housing units above what we would already need. So that's 2 large subdivisions. By 2040, it's 11,000 added housing units. That's a little bit of a different way to look at it, but it's pretty significant. I'm sure you know some pretty large subdivisions in the area. Now you're adding, by 2040, 2 more of those on top of what we would already normally expect growth-wise, and then much more moving forward into the future. And we can take our future land use mapping from our comprehensive planning, and we can actually make a projection about where we think these people are going to move and live in the county. So you can see it's a little washed out on here, unfortunately, but what you see is you have areas around the city areas, like take Newberry, for example, there, where you see that red, that's high density suburban housing. But you also see a spread into the rural areas of the county where you see more and more people moving. So basically you have a lot more urban footprint in the county moving forward in the future. And that's, like I said earlier, that's going to have impacts on some other things too. And again, from a water quality perspective, more development means more pollutants. There are some things, we have a stormwater treatment code in Alachua County that deals pretty effectively with pollutant discharges to surface waters, and the state is also looking at adopting new rules that are very similar to ours statewide. So I think the good news there is that when it comes to lakes and rivers, the effects of this added development, I think, are going to be pretty blunted as far as water quality degradation. Groundwater, that's a different story. Groundwater's been notoriously difficult to protect. So I think that's probably where we're going to see the water quality impacts the most from all the added population. So we're going to have a lot more neighbors in the future. Hope we all like neighbors, right? All right, so wildfires. Well, with all that population, with population growth in general, but with the added population growth from climate migration, in that expansion of the developed footprint in the county, it's going to lead to added wildfire risk. Plus, the changes in the climate itself are going to make that risk worse. So yeah, what's predicted in the future is that our drought index, which is, and the number of days that we have high wildfire risk, that's going to, it's going to increase. Again, this is the example of the extremes becoming more extreme from climate change, because the high risk, there's not a lot of change. It's going to stay about that 100 days that we have right now, but it's the extreme risk days that are going to grow. So again, it's what climate change means. It's extremes becoming more extreme. And then there's some other things too. Well, and why we're interested in this, I told you earlier, we're a land manager. So we have conservation lands that are largely were acquired to protect water resources, so our lakes, the Santa Fe River. Potentially, as you know, with the changes in fire risk, that changes how we as a land manager, the state's also a big land manager in the county, so is the water management districts. It's going to change how we as land managers protect those conservation lands. And I mentioned fires, and they do have an impact on water quality. There's some other things too that we're going to face in the future with climate change. Hurricanes, especially bad hurricanes, do have they do add to fire risk. There was a fire in the Panhandle after, remember Hurricane Michael when it hit Mexico Beach? So it was 2 years after that when I drove through there to a conference, and there are whole areas of forest where it's just trees knocked over. All of that is fuel, and there was actually a pretty major wildfire in the years following that was attributed in part back to hurricane debris. Changing species composition. So that's something else too that sometimes gets forgotten about climate change, is you have species that would typically not live here because it's too cold will now migrate into the area. And that does actually change your fire risk. The different vegetation does change your risk. And then I mentioned the wildland urban interface. This is basically where development meets undeveloped land. And we use the climate projections that we had with climate migration factored in to look at what that interface is going to look like in the future. And it's interestingly, it's a pretty steady growth. It grows by about 33% over during our assessment period. So 2040, 33% increase, 67% increase by 2070, and by 2100, almost 100% increase. So I found that interesting. It was almost a steady growth. All right, so changing rainfall patterns. And now it's just a little bit different, and not so much extreme events, but just overall on an annual basis, when is rainfall going to come and in what form? So again, the extremes become more extreme. We're not expecting to see a very big difference in the amount of rainfall we see on an annual basis. So, somewhere in that 50, 52, 53 inches a year on average is what we see now. There's a little bit of fluctuation in that, but it's pretty much going to stay the same. And that's the green bar. And the same thing too, during the wet season, dry season, such as they may be in length, there's not a lot of fluctuation in there. But what we are seeing is that the storm events, instead of that nice little afternoon thunderstorm, now you're going to see more severe thunderstorms, more of the tropical systems potentially. So the rainfall's coming in bigger chunks. And when rainfall comes in bigger chunks, it means more runoff, it means more potential for flooding, but also means that more pollutants, whether it's nutrients, sediments, heavy metals, more pollutants are being transported. That's going to put more burden on our stormwater management systems, both to control flooding, but also to remove those pollutants. And so there's potentially impacts to our waterways from that. And so if this rainfall is coming in bigger chunks, but we're not expecting too much of an increase overall in total rainfall, that means that the periods between the rainfall are becoming drier. Never want to take an individual weather event and subscribe it completely to climate change, but I'll get an example of this actually happened this year. If everybody remembers a week, and I think it was beginning of July, late end of June, beginning of July, where it's just every day, almost every morning, there was a heavy thunderstorm. And then the next week, nothing. So, that's an example of the type of pattern that I think we'll see more of in the future. So, as a property owner, what do you do? I went from, I didn't have a run, I got to the point the second week, I had to run my irrigation system for the first time in a year because it was so dry. And I'll say that, Stacy, our program director, is always teasing me, you shouldn't be running your irrigation system. That's a waste of our potable water supplies. And I always answer with it, the reason I run my irrigation system when my lawn starts to dry out is because one year I lit my yard on fire. So I like to barbecue, so I have a smoker. And at the time I had one that had a firebox. And so I had the firebox on a pair of tongs and to put it out to put more wood in, and the tongs broke. And the firebox landed smack on a dry backyard. And I'm like, good thing my hose is right here. So I had a big burn mark in my yard. So that's my excuse for not letting the yard dry out. So with these changing rainfall patterns, there's potentially impacts to both surface water bodies and groundwater. In terms of groundwater, we're going to see more variation in groundwater levels in the future. The dry years, the aquifer is going to be lower than it is now. Wet years may be a little bit higher. But in dry years, the take-home message from this is that in dry years, there are parts of the county here, mostly if you went from the northeast to the southwest and drew a line through the middle of the county, there are wells in that part of the county that potentially could run dry in the future. in a dry year, during a dry year. And so if you're a homeowner on a well and you're facing that, that's a big deal because now you don't have water to drink, you don't have water to bathe in. So it's also potentially a financial burden because having that well drilled deeper so that it stays functional in a dry year, that comes at a cost. On surface waters, over the long term, and I have, the next slide shows this graphically. We do think over the long term that water levels in our lakes, with the exception of Lake Santa Fe, which seems a little more resilient for some reason, we do think water levels in the lakes are going to decrease. And that is really going to hit later on after 2040. And we know from work that we've done in the past is that when water levels fall in, say, Noonan's Lake or Wakalusa Lake, the water quality gets worse. So both of those lakes are already impaired by they do not meet state standards for nitrogen and phosphorus. We have load reduction allocations. So basically that's projects that I have to do to reduce the nutrient inputs into those lakes. But climate change is going to start to work against me at some point. So I'm potentially looking at down the road of having to do more than I would have otherwise to keep the water quality in the lake where it should be. And of course, with drier periods being dry, there's going to be more potential for irrigation. People are going to want to run their irrigation systems more. And also potentially there's going to be that temptation to add more fertilizer to your lawn, to your landscaping, so that you can keep it looking good, during those dry periods. All right, so this is the graph for Noonan's Lake. So more or less, and we see this pattern in all the lakes to some extent. Orange Lake the same way. Lake Santa Fe seems to be a little more resilient, so it's a little more muted. But the bottom line is that things hold pretty steady until 2040. So 17 years from now, things still pretty steady. But then after that, when you really start to see the temperatures rise and things start to get a little drier, then at that point, lake levels are going to drop. And if you're in the little red bar on there, it's only, I regret that it's only a small footnote next to the first bar, but that little red bar is the minimum projected lake level for that time period. So if you look at that 2070, 2100 period, that's a lake that's quite a bit smaller than it is today, potentially. With the Santa Fe River, it's a little bit different. The Santa Fe River responds differently than a lake. So right now, if you look at this over time, the first thing that you say here is that we're pretty low right now in terms of flow in the river, and we do expect to see an increase in the short term. And that's as we get more heavier rain events, more runoff, we'll see more flow in the river. But then after 2030, the same trend starts to set in, where you start to have declining flows in the river. The good news in this is that even by the end of the century, the flows have gone down, but they're back to where they are today. So, that's again a little bit of maybe positive news. And most of that downward trend is because of declining base flow. So the groundwater that seeps into the lake, groundwater that seeps into the river keeps the flow going when it's not raining. So the increase in 2030, more runoff, but after that, as base flow starts to go down, then overall flow starts to go down too. All right, everybody's favorite topic, hurricanes, right? Because we just love when they're on their way, because it means more work for me. My emergency management job for the county is I staff a shelter, so I'm a shelter manager. So it's long 12-hour shifts. All right, so the other thing too with extreme events is that this is when the flooding occurs. So this is when the infrastructure in the county is going to be impacted. So this is when roads are unpassable. How many of you have lived in a subdivision where a hurricane flooded your sanitary lift station? It's not fun because the sewage overflows. So now you have sewage and floodwaters combined together. So you have health hazards along with that too. But also it pretty much means your plumbing is pretty much non-functional. It's worse if you have also worse if you have a flooded septic tank. So same thing happens in that case too. So what we did, or what our consultant did, is we built a county-wide inundation model. So basically it's a flooding model for the entire county. Very high resolution. We're talking down to feet of resolution. And includes over 14,000 stormwater pipes and structures. It was calibrated. What we mean by calibrated is we ran the rainfall from Hurricane Irma and Tropical Storm Elsa and then compared that against what we observed after the event. So when we went out and we put a nail in the road at the high water mark, we compared the model results to what we actually saw. And so once we get a good result, a good match, then we know our model is reflecting past conditions well. So then we take it and put a hypothetical rainfall in. So what we do is we take, well, I'll give you an example. 100-year, one-day storm, say about 10 inches of rain in 24 hours. We apply a change factor to it. So basically we multiply 10 inches by 1.35, and so that's 13.5 inches. So that in 2040 will be the new 100-year storm. So a 35% increase in rainfall. So then we run that new rainfall through the model, and it tells us what's going to be inundated by that storm. And then we can compare the difference from now to then, and then we see the impact. We see for critical infrastructure what now is going to be vulnerable in 2040 and 2070, even down to the parcel level, down to the individual house. We can see which houses are going to become vulnerable in the future. So here's an example of an area we got three on your left. The first is the flooding that was observed during Hurricane Irma. So, and the road there running through it, that's the interstate. So major thoroughfare, our biggest thoroughfare. So you can see that in Hurricane Irma, interstate wasn't impacted, but Irma was not the 100-year, 10-day storm. That in this particular area, the 10-day storm is the one that really governs, that really determines how bad the flooding is. If the current 100-year storm occurred, you'd start to see water on the interstate. So you'd have some areas of the interstate that would be impacted, potentially not passable. But by 2070, the 10-day storm, it's definitely not passable. So this is an example of critical infrastructure. Now, this is the state's infrastructure in this case, but this is an example of the critical infrastructure impacts that we're trying to identify so that then we can do efforts, projects, whatever it needs to be, to try to prevent this from actually happening in the future. And then we can look at it at the neighborhood scale. And again, unfortunately, the projector is washing this out a little bit. But you might be able to make out. So you see the different shades of blue. The darker blue is deeper water. But if you see at the edges of that, you might see some areas that maybe look a little yellow, pink, orange, depending on how you perceive the color. Those are areas that not now, they're not at risk now, but in the future they're going to be. So I'll point here. This is an area right in here. So this is an area, you have homes right in here, and I'll wait for you to move the pointer so that people online can see what I'm pointing at here. Yep. So this area where it's in yellow here, we don't think that these houses would be at risk now, but we do think that by 2070, they will be. I actually don't know the name of the neighborhood. It's just we just pulled it out as an example. So once we're done with this, we'll have a graphical interface that we can see that we'll be able to look around. But I don't recognize which one this is, unfortunately. And then we'll do the same thing with all of our critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure is defined by the state. They have a rather long list of critical infrastructure, some of it which I think is intuitive: roads, wastewater facilities, lift stations, drinking water facilities, water treatment plants, emergency facilities, police stations, fire stations, hospitals, but also some things that maybe you want to think of. They include cultural resources on that too. So parks, conservation lands, historic sites, cemeteries, all of that's considered by the state to be critical. And we had to do an inventory throughout the county of that. A lot of the inventory we own, the city of Gainesville also owns a lot. So the city also provided a lot of work in this effort. And most of our smaller municipalities also provided some input too on this. So what are we seeing as far as our critical infrastructure? So as far as roads, well, as far as road segments impacted by flooding, that's going to be at 38%. It's going to increase by 38% by 2040, and then by 54% by 2070. And now I'll give you the results that I just got today. All right. So as far as what the state, oh, sorry, everybody hear me okay? Okay. I'll try to take the microphone off and hold it. So as far as critical infrastructure, about 16% of our critical infrastructure is currently at risk of flooding today. By 2040, that's going to increase to 19%. And then by 2070, it's going to increase to 20%. As far as our critical emergency facilities, about 20% of them are at risk right now. It's going to increase to 24% by 2040 and 26% by 2070. And then as far as community and historic resources, about 9% are vulnerable now. It's going to increase to 13% in 2040 and 14% by 2070. So we're going to have some added work to do. Now, the good news in that is that you might perceive that as to be maybe a little bit smaller percentage increase. That's actually good news. If that number was much higher than 20%, I'd be tearing my hair out. But I think so. There is a little bit of good news in that. So we are going to see an increase in critical infrastructure. So we are going to have some work to do, not just the areas that we know are a problem now, but we are going to see some new areas added. But hopefully, on those numbers, my first reaction to that is, I think it's manageable. So that's a little bit of good news. There is good news with climate change. All right. So where do we go from here? So we are really at, like I said, I got those results today. So that tells me that we're probably a month or two at most from finishing this project. And so once we're done with that, we're going to move into the last phases of this climate action plan process. So where we are right now is on the end of the second step, defining the situation. So the vulnerability analysis was the last thing that we needed to finish in that phase. And so now we'll move into the evaluation and planning phase, so the development of the action plan, which also included prioritization and action. So what is a climate action plan? Well, it means many things, and it'll incorporate many things, but my engineer brain says that a climate action plan is going to be a list of projects to address some of the critical infrastructure and some of the water quality issues. That's my engineer brain, but there'll be other things in there too that I probably haven't thought of. And this is the vision statement of the Climate Action Plan. I know you've seen this before. So to guide, develop, and cultivate environmentally, socially, and economically resilient strategies and equitable solutions to climate change for the whole community. So the whole reason we did this is to come up with solutions so that moving forward into the future, we have the same quality of life in Alachua County that we have today. All right, so I know I took up a lot of time, and it looks like I took 55 minutes. So, but I think we have time for questions. I do appreciate when it's either me or our consultant who has to give this presentation, we're usually confined to a time period of a half hour, 45 minutes at most. So I appreciate you taking an hour to listen to this. It means I can cover a lot more and go into a lot more detail. I saw two in the back there.
I'm curious what kinds of tools are available to the public to use in terms of your modeling, you know, as we make our decisions about where we want to live.
Yeah, so good question. There are a couple of ways to answer that. We have tools out there that are available now. And particularly the one that I would say dealing with flooding is we have our online GIS platform, MapGenius. I think we're changing to a new one. But we do make our FEMA floodplain layer available to the public. That's very critical. FEMA floodplain analysis is different than this. It typically uses it typically uses a different type of model, but it affects requirements on a property for insurance. So if you are going to get a mortgage on a property that is in a FEMA floodplain, you'll be required to buy flood insurance. So that is a tool that's out there to anybody looking to buy a home. I don't know where the platform is going to be, so we haven't selected it yet, I don't think. But the vulnerability analysis results, I think, are also going to be out there. But keep in mind, this is not FEMA floodplain, so this does trigger an insurance requirement. Mm-hmm.
Really loud, please, for the Wait, one moment. Yeah. Got to have the class on Zoom.
Okay. The average annual precipitation seemed pretty constant as you looked into the future, but we have those inundations of rain. Is that taken into consideration with that FEMA floodplain? Because that's tricky.
So a couple of things, there are significant differences. FEMA floodplain modeling uses a different type of model. So what we've done here they wouldn't be acceptable to FEMA. There are other components that would have to be involved in it. The other thing too is that legally the FEMA floodplains have to be a reflection of things as they are today, not as they are in the future. FEMA doesn't look forward into the future. And that's because the financial implications of that. You know, you have to, if you're making someone buy insurance, you need to know that it actually is happening right now.
Thank you for your talk today. Even though it's depressing, it's still good to know that we're getting prepared, because that's the essential thing. I have one question about sinkholes. Mm-hmm. Are you expecting that we'll have more, and if so, what areas?
The answer is yes. We do think that the results would suggest that there could be increased sinkhole activity, and there are two types of sinkhole formation. I'm not a geologist, so we do have a geologist in our office who can explain all of this better. In the western part of the county, what we typically see are solution features, and they typically happen after heavy rainfall events in stormwater ponds. So most of the time, they don't impact structures, but they do impact water quality, because once you have a sinkhole in a stormwater pond, until the sinkhole's fixed, all the pollutants in the stormwater are going straight into the aquifer. So yes, with more extreme rain events, I would expect to see more solution features. The other type of sinkhole are the cave collapse. You typically see that where you have a confining layer like the Hawthorne group, and that's a case where the cave just grows so big that eventually the roof collapses in. We also do think that we'll see some more of that too, in part because if groundwater levels drop, the water actually tends to support the cave roof a little bit. So we do see that in dry periods, drought periods, that you potentially could see more of those too.
Okay, let's go to a Zoom question with Pat Harden, if you'd like to unmute, and then Phyllis, we'll get to your chat in just a moment. Pat? Okay. Let's look at our chat. So this is all from Phyllis Saarinen. She's on our science.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
go ahead, Pat.
Okay, no, I had unmuted it and it muted itself again. I'm sorry about that.
I actually did that. We had some feedback, so go ahead.
Okay. Question, the floodplains, well, the wetlands, whether they're constant, intermittent, or isolated, if we have any left, during the droughts will be, of course, very dry. And I'm sure when you went to your further estimation, more rainfall, you considered that additional storage before, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. The inundation models do take into account a starting water level in all the water bodies. I would also add to that wetlands in drought periods. That's one of the reasons that you see declining water quality, especially in a lake. That in a drought, when the lake levels and the lake starts to recede, it becomes disconnected from its fringing wetlands, and so that's also contributing a factor to poor water quality in the lake. But yes, that was the storage in those wetlands were taken into consideration. I mentioned it, but I think I failed to explain when I said the resolution of the model down to in cases 2.5 feet of resolution. That's topographic resolution. So that's we see all of those little depressions in the landscape where the wetlands are. So we see that in that model, and so we're able to take all of that storage into account.
Thank you. Phyllis, would you care to unmute, or do you want me to read what you have?
Either one, but I have a number of comments and questions, of course. That's me. But most critically, it's my understanding that the legislature in the last session passed a law that prohibits local governments from passing environmental regulations that are more strict than the state's. So how would Alachua County, as an example of a local government, get around those strictures to make more effective protections against what we see or expect to happen?
I'm not sure which bill you're referring to, but there was a bill that was proposed from a representative in the southwest part of the state. I refer to it as the mother of all preemptions because it would have done exactly what you're describing, would have preempted local governments from basically doing anything along those lines. The bill never made it out of committee, so it was never voted on and never passed. That said, every year we are in a tendency of the state preempting local governments. A lot of times what happens is that the bills get altered so that the preemption doesn't become quite as serious as it would have been. And oftentimes things are grandfathered in. So for example, I don't think there's a preemption on water quality rules. I think that, like I said, that the omnibus preemption bill did not pass out of the legislature. But a lot of times also too, things that we've done in the past would be grandfathered in. So I think we're still in good shape now. We'll see what the next session holds though.
Phyllis, I'm going to jump in here, and we do have one question here from the audience, but I do want to mention the Right to Clean Water petition, which is a petition to put an amendment on our state constitution that would allow any of us individual citizens to sue the state for not doing what is already on the books. We already have water quality laws on the books, but the state is not enforcing them. And you can't at the moment do anything as a citizen except change the government to fix that. So I will make sure I bring those. We brought them to the climate class 2 semesters ago. I'll bring them next week. And if you are so motivated, you can sign those to put an amendment to the Constitution on the November ballot. We have one question here.
I actually have 2, but let's start as a follow-up to Phyllis's question. The zero waste ordinance that was passed, is it being enforced or is there a lot of wiggle room?
That would actually be a question really best addressed to our solid waste director. So I hesitate to give you an answer, but on the county side, we enforce our ordinances.
Okay.
So I won't speak for any other jurisdiction, but we do enforce our ordinances.
Okay. Do you know if there's an exception made for larger communities?
That I do not know.
Okay. Switching to the FEMA maps, the flood zone maps are usually pretty broad. They have numbers on them.
Mm-hmm.
Are there elevation maps available so that even if you're in a certain flood, if you're building an access road, would it be better to go one way than another?
Yes, all of the FEMA mapping is available online, and it can also by contacting our Public Works Department. If you can also see the paper copies of it too. And yes, I'll answer the second part of that question 2 ways. If you're doing development work, so if you're a developer and the engineer working for the developer, you have to take the floodplain information into account. We will not let you put a road through a floodplain that is going to be below the flood elevation. Now, if you're doing it on, say, on a private basis, like you have like a large tract of land or something, and you're building an access road, we might not necessarily see that because it doesn't rise to the level of development, but you're always welcome to contact either environmental protection or public works, and they can tell you what that elevation is in that area. Again, I want to emphasize that there's a difference here. Just because an area is not shown on a FEMA flood map does not mean that it cannot, quote, flood. To be considered a flood on a FEMA flood map, it has to meet certain criteria in terms of how deep the water is. So if you only have 3 inches of water, that could be enough to impact access, but that might not necessarily be mapped on a FEMA floodplain.
I have a follow-up question to that. In terms of the ability now with the computer program you have to isolate a particular address, OCAMIC could look themselves up, Phyllis or I or some of the other folks who do not live here could look up our address and we could see, is that available or will it be on a public website at some point as part of the climate action plan?
Yeah, the current information, like the FEMA information, that's been out there a long time and you can access that.
Not FEMA, I'm talking about the overlays that you're talking about.
I believe the plan is yes, but we don't have a platform yet for it.
Right, but so. it will be available to public. I think that's tremendous to really involve the community. Okay, one more question.
Thanks for a very nice talk, great slides.
Thank you.
My question is, can you comment more on climate migration? Who exactly are we projecting will migrate here? And is there any implication for what will happen in terms of disruptions, let's say, at the local level?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the climate model that Bieber did, you're not able to tell like exactly how many people from one group or another are going to move, but there has been some work that's been done by others to look at that. And if I remember, I'm going to try to make sure I remember everything, but there are 4 groups of people: the people who have the means to stay and the means to adapt, the people who are going to stay because they don't have the means to move, and then the people who have the means to move, and then I'm trying to think. It was 3 or 4 groups, but the bottom line is there are people who are going to stay where they are now because for whatever reason, their community is able to adapt and protect, be protected from the effects of climate change in the future. And then there are people who are going to stay because they have no other choice. They don't have the means to get out of harm's way. So they're going to contend with the worst effects of, say, sea level rise, for example. The people who are going to move are the people who are able to pick up roots, buy a house in a different area. So that I think is the people who are moving. The people who they're not in a place where they may not be able to adapt, or their community may not be able to adapt, but they're able to get out of harm's way.
Shane, thank you. You've been awesome presenter.
Are there any
Really
more online
appreciate
questions
that.
or any more? I can take a few
anyone
more
else?
questions.
No, Julianne's giving me the. Julianne's giving me the.
I went overtime. Look at that. I was afraid I was going to be under time.
Oh, no. Next week, Nathan Crabb will be speaking to us. He's the editor of The Invading Sea, and you may remember that he used to be the editor of the Gainesville Sun when we had a letter to the editor and an editor. So he'll be speaking on climate and media. So I look forward to seeing you all next week. Any closing comments?
Yeah, I did want to make a closing comment. I think you commented that the results may be a little bit depressing. And I can see that. But I do want to say that I do also see some good news in this, that maybe things aren't quite as bad as they could be. And we used a very conservative assumption as far as what the world does as far as carbon emissions in the future. We assumed that very little would be done. I guess where I'm going with that is don't feel too depressed, because there is good news in it too. But if there are things that you can do as individuals. There's a lot of things you can do to reduce your own carbon footprint, my own carbon footprint, but it's a lot of information. I know it can be overwhelming, but stay positive.
The Citizens Climate Action Committee is looking for people to sit on that board. It's a very exciting board, and I'm a fly on the wall. You don't have to join it. You could also be a fly on the wall. So I'll stay after a little if any of you are interested in how to do that. Or go ahead and be on that Citizens Climate Action Committee. It's very exciting that Gainesville has that. Thank you. Shane, thank you.
And we have other committees too. We have EPAC, which is our Environmental Advisory Board, Rural Concerns Advisory Board, Land Conservation Board. So that's a great way to get involved in the county, is to serve on one of those advisory boards.